This week, I am so delighted to talk with someone I've admired through his research and books. And now we had the opportunity to meet over Zoom to talk about his work researching Franco Basaglia, the visionary psychiatrist who was the driving force behind closing the asylums in Italy in the 1960s. Welcome to Heartforward, Conversations from the Heart. Professor John Foote is a professor of modern Italian history in the School of Modern Languages in the UK at the University of Bristol. His 2015 book, Franco Basaglia, The Man Who Closed the Asylums, is a comprehensive look at the life and impact of a man who died too soon in 1980 at the age of 57. Were it not for the research and commitment of John Foote, we would very likely not have access to this rich insight into the life of Franco Basaglia. You'll hear John's story about stumbling into a screening of a movie while visiting Trieste many years ago that piqued his curiosity to learn more, and that's where it started. What you will also hear about in this interview is the plan to finally translate a book that has remained obscured to the English-speaking audience since its publication in 1968, the Istituzione Negata. In English, that would be the Negated Institution. This book was seminal in inspiring and influencing a new generation of psychiatrists and others engaged in this world. And soon, with the anticipated English translation, perhaps it will spark a radical rethinking of how we approach the human being in our mental health delivery systems. Heads up to the audio quality of this interview. We initially conducted it over Zoom and ran into some technical challenges after the first 15 minutes. So we regrouped 2 weeks later to finish our conversation. It was noon in Los Angeles and 9 p.m. in the UK, and Wi-Fi instability required us to troubleshoot. So we conducted the remainder of the interview over WhatsApp. I'm grateful to my technical gurus at Verdugo Sound here in Glassell Park, who figured out how to extract the best possible sound. Enjoy the interview. Good evening, John. I know you are in Milan. It is evening and it's morning here in Los Angeles. Just so pleased to meet you over Zoom and welcome to this podcast.
Well, nice to meet you too. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Awesome. Well, John, I have read everything you've written about Franco Basaglia, and I think you have done the world a great service in documenting his amazing life and his vision. Well, we will get into that in a few moments. I'm really curious about you. I would love to hear a little bit about your origin story. And I know you're in academia. I know you're obviously fluent in Italian, which is something I would aspire to do. It's probably too late in my life to get there. But yeah, share with me a little bit about who you are and where you came from and what generated your interest in Italian history and culture.
So I suppose my parents were both kind of 68ers. I was brought up in North London, and I sort of got into Italian history after university. After my first degree, I won a grant to do a PhD, but in those days, it kind of you just got the grant and then you decided what to do. And I wanted to work with someone called Paul Ginsburg, who's a historian of Italy in Cambridge, and he was an Italian historian. So it was kind of really a little bit by chance. My great-grandmother was Italian, so I do have some connections there. My mum was a great lover of Italy and always taking us on holiday. So, there were things going on about Italy, usually to Venice, which is, a strange coincidence. I probably looked at the asylum, which was probably still open when I was a child, and had no idea what it was. But there you go. Because it's right there in front of the lagoon in Venice, the male and the female asylum. And then I sort of became an academic at a time when it was much easier to become an academic than it is now. And I've always specialized in 20th century Italian history, politics, moving around between different subjects, from my early work on the First World War to memory, to a lot of stuff on sport. So I like to change subject. And Basaglia was one of the big things that I've done, I suppose, in my life, one of the big projects I sort of undertook.
I thought it was interesting. I think it was in your book, The Man Who Closed the Asylum, where you mentioned that you had stumbled upon Franco Basaglia when you had seen a film. It was a film called San Clemente, and then that was just a pivotal moment for you. Tell us about that film and what happened.
I was in Trieste working on another book. Trieste is sort of borderlands, and there were a lot of memory wars there and civil wars. And I was working on a book which I published soon afterwards called Italy's Divided Memory. So I was in Trieste, and then by sheer chance, it was the anniversary of the Basaglia law. It was 2008, so I can date it quite. And there were lots of events going on. I knew about Franco Basaglia because in Italy, he's kind of a household name. Everyone knows a little bit about him. And I went to a few things. There was this incredible theatre show, packed out with people from the mental health services taking part. And one night in a small cinema on the edge of town, there was this film called San Clemente, introduced by someone called Pepe Dell'Acqua, who I'd literally never heard of. There's about 10 people there. And it's an incredibly powerful and very, very difficult to forget film. It's shot inside the Venice island asylum of San Clemente as they were closing by a French photographer, filmmaker called Raymond Depardon. It's actually at the moment a big exhibition of his work going on in Milan. And it's an extremely powerful, distressing film. And it kind of, the light bulb went on my head and I thought, this would be a great thing to work on. And I kind of started digging around, and actually not that many people had worked on it. And it's quite interesting because he's such an important figure. So that set off the kind of search for grants and funding and time to begin a project. So it was really that moment that changed things for me. And it could have easily, if I'd come 2 weeks later, I would have missed all the events, and I probably wouldn't have done that work at all.
That is so fascinating. And I've met Pepe Dell'Acqua also. So I have a sense of just what that must have felt like to be in Trieste. And you know what? Explain for people who don't know about Trieste, and it's so close to Slovenia, and it doesn't really feel like Italy. So just a little tiny history lesson of Trieste.
The Trieste is right on the border between the sort of west and the east. It's this kind of incredible mix of. It was a key part of the Habsburg Empire. It was the main port of the Habsburg Empire, which stretched right across half of Europe, and so it became incredibly rich under the Habsburg Empire. And in fact, you see that Habsburg Austrian, Middle European kind of feel in the architecture, but it's also Italian and it's also Slovenian. So it's this contested territory, very beautiful, right on the border. And for a long time, it was a very, very kind of violent place. In some ways, you could say Italian fascism was kind of born there really early on, violently. And it was contested right through the 30s, 40s, Second World War, the Cold War, and so on. Now it's quite a sleepy place, because all that border is now open, really, and you can walk over it. But for a long time, that was the Cold War border. So it's an amazing place. I think very much off the beaten track. People don't know about it, but I'd really recommend going there for so many reasons. And it's a really kind of fascinating city and extremely beautiful. And the food is amazing as well.
Exactly. Although it's not really Italian food as you would find in Milan. It definitely is different. So, boy, that is like a twist of fate that you were there for that movie, and you then embarked upon this the book, The Man Who Closed the Asylums, which is about Franco Basaglia. It's hard to imagine that we would not have that book right now, because it is really an outstanding kind of tracing of his legacy and his work and the evolution in the whole mental health system in Italy and the impact that it has had. So how did you go about researching that book? So if you started it after that film in 2008, and I think it was published in 2016?
Yeah, in Italian, it was a bit earlier, in 2000, I think 14 or 15. So it then came out in English afterwards, slightly unusually. It doesn't usually goes the other way around, although I wrote it in English. I got a small grant from the Wellcome Trust to do a kind of recce, which was great. So I went to a few cities and looked at what material they had, and made a little tiny film with a friend of mine. Went to Trieste, went to Gorizia, went to Parma, I think, Venice. So I kind of looked around and I realized there was tons of material. And there were lots of people to talk to. And the people in Trieste were very welcoming. There was a woman called Chiara Struti there at that time who had done a lot of work in terms of memory and the archive and was incredibly helpful. Unfortunately, she died very young, quite soon afterwards, but she was very helpful to me. So I realized that there was enough material for a project. In fact, probably too much, I've now realized. And then I applied for a much bigger grant, which allowed me to have 3 years off, which was like gold dust in academia. And that's when I did the research, went around and collected the material for the book. And that led to a series, and I'm sure we can talk about incredible encounters with people. I mean, of all the things I've done, and I mean, I've done lots of things which I found very interesting. There's nothing has come close to the kind of people I've come across and met, and many of whom are now dead, unfortunately, who were involved in that movement, be they psychiatrists or patients or nurses or journalists or filmmakers, all kinds of people that I came across.
So tell us a little bit about Franco Basaglia and what was surprising about what you learned about him in this time of research. Someone who would have if not for your book would still be somewhat obscure to the English-speaking world.
Well, Franco Basaglia was a psychiatrist. I think you need to say one thing really need to say about him is that at a very young age he was growing up under fascism. He came from quite a rich family in Venice, but he became an anti-fascist at school as a teenager, and he actually was an active anti-fascist and was arrested for anti-fascist activity and put in prison as a teenager in quite a scary prison in Venice under Nazi occupation. So all of these things have a very deep impact on him, which we could talk about later. He became a psychiatrist studying at Padova University, which is quite near to Venice. And he wanted to be an academic, I think. He was very, he studied a lot. He lived his whole life in university. He was an assistant to quite a famous sort of neurologist. And he was interested in new ideas, but I think he really wanted to become an academic, but he didn't become one. There was no role post for him. And by chance, in 1961, he didn't really have a job. He was married. He had kids. He didn't, really have a job. He got the opportunity came up to be the director of a psychiatric hospital right on the edge of Italy, quite near to Trieste, in a place called Gorizia. And he took the job, and that's when everything starts to happen.
Yeah, so we always equate him with Trieste, but the journey started in Gorizia. And from your book, I just wanted to pull this one quote. It says, Gorizia's manicomio, which is the Italian word for madhouse, was a dark and sinister institution, a dumping ground for the poor and the deviant, with cages for the most unruly patients and beds with holes in them through which the immobilized could defecate. Some patients were tied to their beds. Most of the time, even when inmates were allowed outside, they would often be bound to trees or benches. And as horrific as that image is, I have to tell you, I've visited LA County Jail, where the most seriously mentally ill people are chained to furniture, and some of them are in solitary rooms. So when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, we have not improved much here in the United States. And that's why Basaglia is so inspiring. So John, he comes to Gorizia and encountering these conditions, which I just described from your book. And in a sense, you say he starts kind of a quiet revolution with respect to how to approach the institution. And I'm wondering if you can talk, I think he was there for 7 or 8 years and made some incredible strides. How would you describe his guiding principles for how he approached this assignment?
I think he had a kind of visceral hate, sort of disgust towards the institution which he saw in front of him. He talks a lot about the smell of it and then the bars. His first impact was kind of almost traumatic, almost so much that he wanted to actually give up. And then it translated that kind of disgust, sort of almost, physical disgust towards the place and the way it treated people, translated into small little acts of rebellion, like he wouldn't give permission for patients to be tied up, which was kind of routine in that institution from who knows when. And that kind of shocked some of the people who worked there, because that's what they did. And very, very slowly he began to change things. I mean, he didn't really have anybody to help him apart from his wife, Franco Basaglia, who wasn't even employed in the asylum. And so he kind of, he started to change things, humanize the institution bit by bit, against the resistance of the other psychiatrists, against the resistance of the authorities. And he began to bring in people who agreed with him to help him, and he had to fight to get other people employed. So he began to build up what he called an équipe, in using the French word, a group of like-minded psychiatrists and psychologists, who formed a very important kind of very dynamic group in that period in the 60s in Gorizia. So it was a slow, he didn't really have a plan. It was a slow process of opening up the hospital, bringing in humanistic policies, which became more and more political as the 60s wore on.
So would you describe it then as I'm trying to think of what was guiding him in his heart. Was it to just treat people as humans? Was it to shun the constraints of the institution? I've heard reference to the notion of maybe this was the birthing of the notion of a therapeutic community.
Yes, I mean, he went to many places to see what was going on in other places. So he wanted to find examples of change. So he went to a place called Dingleton in Scotland, which was an open asylum, and he brought back some examples from there, and he started having what was extremely important were the meetings, which he started in 65, which were kind of open meetings of patients, and they became, in many ways, one of the most important things of 1968, not just in Italy, but in fact in the world, in my opinion, these incredible meetings of the patients. They weren't just meetings, they actually voted on stuff and had motions and ran them themselves. So there was a giving back of power, a giving across of power to the patients. There was kind of basic humanistic things like allowing people to wear their own clothes, not cutting their hair off, giving them back their wedding rings. And then he kind of theorized a lot of this as well. He wrote very early on in 1964 that he thought the asylum was not a place you could reform, that it actually had to be destroyed. And really very few people were saying that in 1964. So there's a whole mixture of things, theory, stuff he was reading, Goffman, Foucault, and, all these other kind of texts that were circulating, Lang, his everyday practice in the asylum, and, the radicalness of the 60s coming into that asylum as well. Bringing down the doors, opening up the wards. They were scared of what was going to happen, so they did it very slowly, but they did it bit by bit, so that by 1967, every single ward was open.
So it's so interesting. Do you think it's because Gorizia was off the beaten track and up near, I guess, at that time, the Yugoslavian border, that nobody was really paying attention? How did he have so much discretion?
Well, directors of asylums were incredibly powerful institutional figures. I mean, they had kind of almost total control over what went on in the asylum. They were under the control of the provincial governments. He was often clashing with them. Gorizia nobody ever went to Gorizia. It had been very important historically and politically, but it wasn't. So they kind of went under the radar. People did pick up on it, particularly psychiatrists and politicians, and they did go and see it, particularly towards 67, 68, when you have the explosion of student movements after the US. You have it in Italy as well, and they started to try and copy it back in their own silence, but it went under the radar until the Kit published a book in 1968, just at the perfect time for it to hit the zeitgeist, which was called Istituzione Negata, edited by Basaglia, and that book became a bestseller. At that point, the example of Gorizia became famous. And the second thing happened, which was a famous documentary filmmaker came down to Gorizia and filmed a 20-minute documentary, which went on national TV. 8 million people saw it. So it suddenly becomes famous. But for 6 or 7 years, they were working kind of in obscurity and were able to do a lot of things, probably because they weren't under any kind of reflectors.
And what was the name of that documentary? Is it still something that is accessible?
Yeah, it's on. You can get it on YouTube. You can get it on. And I always show it to my students. It's called I Giardini di Abele, the Gardens of Abel, and it's a very powerful documentary. But the man who made it was an extremely well-known man called Sergio Zavoli, who died just last year. Actually, lived to a great age into his 90s, and it was extreme. One of the most important things about it was it actually interviewed inmates, patients, which no one had ever done, and it didn't hide their faces, and that was something revolutionary. And I think people really, some people were horrified, but a lot of people picked up on the example of Gorizia with the book and the TV program. And I've written also about that program, actually. But it was incredibly influential. And the other thing they did was they got photographers to come in and also to go in. Most of the other asylums were still pretty horrible. Gorizia had become quite nice by then. And they made a photo book out of that, which was also extremely influential, called To Die Because of Your Class. Morire di classe.
I will include links to that documentary in the show notes, and I'm going to encourage people to read your book, The Man Who Closed the Asylums, because it goes to such great detail about a lot of the revolutionary things that you're referencing right now. So let's then talk about the segue from how it was that he left Gorizia and then moved to Trieste.
Yes, so towards the end of the 60s, I think he was very tired. And some, problematic things happened in Gorizia. The equipe wasn't quite so united by the end of the 60s. There were a lot of politics going on by that time and a lot of division. And I think he wanted to rest. They were in the hospital all day. Their commitment was incredible. So he decided to leave Gorizia a bit under a cloud. I talk about this in my book in detail. And then he went briefly to a place called Colorno near Parma to become director there. But he didn't really manage to achieve very much there. He wasn't given the same kind of resources. And then in 1971, a politician from Trieste, a local politician, the man in charge of the asylum, politically speaking, a man called Michele Zanetti, came to Basaglia and said, I'll give you complete autonomy. I'll give you a lot of money. You come to Trieste, you close down, you reform my asylum. And he accepted that because it gave him the power and the resources to actually do something on a much grander scale. In Gorizia, he couldn't even open a daycare centre. They wouldn't let him do it. But in Trieste, he had kind of unlimited resources. And it was a huge asylum. It was a big city. It was a very different situation. So he went to Trieste and then he hit the ground running in Trieste. No messing about with therapeutic communities. And, he said, we're going to close this asylum down. We're going to get everybody out. We're going to open up daycare centres and different kinds of ways of treating mental illness. And Trieste became an incredible example of that not just for Italy, but for the whole world in some ways. For
the world, yes. So I want to segue to the book that you helped to put together. It was based on a symposium that was held in Oxford in 2018, where people were brought together from throughout the world to discuss his legacy. And where I want to take this conversation now is, under what conditions have the Basaglian ideas taken root in other countries or other cultures? Where has it failed for whatever reason? You described there's a whole series of essays in this book, which is fascinating, that the attempt at this symposium was to try to discern how easily could his ideas be transferred to other countries and other cultures. So what did you learn from that symposium, and what were perhaps some of the examples where these ideas and principles could be embraced?
I think one of the things to understand, which is very important to understand about the Basaglian revolution, is that it wasn't just about asylums, it was also about participation and democracy across a whole series of institutions, including normal medicine, so-called, but also schools, universities, prisons, and so on. So it was very much a kind of universal method. The transmission of the ideas, that is, in a very simplistic way, it's the opening up of asylums, but also the closing down of the asylum system, which Italy was the first country in the world to do for reasons which weren't about cost, but were about that this system was wrong. Italy passed a law in 1978 called the Basaglian Law, which called for the closure of all, and you couldn't build another asylum. It was the end of the asylum system, although it took a long time. And this transmitted in very different ways into different countries. If you take a country like the UK, there was immense psychiatric power which resisted the Basaglian sort of concepts about the asylum. So the psychiatrists and the kind of traditional idea of a humanistic asylum said no to that closure and said no to that radical reform. Often for understandable reasons. They'd had therapeutic communities for ages and they said, this is a system that works. But in other countries, it had a kind of very radical effect. Brazil, for example, the Basaglia went there a few times to give talks and it had a kind of incredible influence over psychiatrists, nurses, students, and so much so that the Brazilian mental health reform basically copied what went on in Italy, and he was a key figure in reforming some of the horrific asylums that there were in Brazil. So it entered into different cultures in different ways, and it depended on psychiatric power, it depended on institutional power, it depended on the political situation in those countries, it depended on which books were translated and which weren't, and sometimes on chance factors. And in some countries, it wasn't heard of at all. In other countries, it led to a massive debate, such as, for example, in Holland, where the Basaglians lined up against the non-Basaglians, for example. So every country was different, but it was certainly talked about and very important in many countries.
Do you see it from the symposium in 2018? Where do you see his flame is still alive? Are they in the countries you just mentioned? Brazil, that was, I guess, the best example. But were there other countries where that flame is still alive?
Yeah, well, I think in Italy, there are many institutional situations which take their sort of inspiration from what happened in the 60s and 70s. It's always worth remembering in Italy doesn't even have criminal asylums. Mm-hmm. It has managed to close down its criminal asylum system, which I think is in some ways even more extraordinary than closing down. And when I tell people that, they often sort of don't think I'm telling the truth, but they have actually done that. So the kind of the revolution, as it were, if you want to call it that, continued right through the 70s, 80s, 90s against massive opposition, 2000s, to, close down all aspects of the institutional, what he called total institutions, where the flame is still alive, certainly in Brazil, certainly in Argentina, and in parts of many other countries. There are many psychiatrists who took or still take inspiration from those ideas. And I think more than the ideas, the practice, that Basaglia's combination of practice and theory was what was so important. You get a lot of theorists from those years who, leave the system, people like Lang, who I think were crucial, but didn't remain within the system. He does. So I think that's one of the crucial lessons. Spain, there's still many areas that, even in places like Wales, which we didn't talk about in the book, there are those who draw inspiration from those ideas. So it's still being circulated, it kind of reviving and being discussed in many countries in the world.
So in the legacy book, you indicated in one of the chapters, and this is a quote, the failure of Basaglia's ideas to be taken up in much of the English-speaking world. It was the failure of Basaglia's ideas to be taken up in the English-speaking world, partly because some of his key writings had not been translated, and it may have inhibited the spread of these principles and ideas. So he is not very well known outside of Italy and in some of these other countries that you mentioned. So talk a little bit about this. What you mentioned the aversion in the UK, but maybe the United States also. Why was it not seen as important to translate these writings for consideration back in the 70s, 80s, 90s?
It's very weird. I mean, the book, the Negated Institution, Institution Negata, was a bestseller in Italy and was translated almost immediately into French, Portuguese, Spanish, German, Dutch, and it had a great influence in those countries. And in some countries was kind of one of the books that people read around that time. But we still don't know exactly why it wasn't translated into English. There are lots of stories and myths and conspiracy theories. Certainly there were some readers who thought the book would be extremely dangerous, psychiatrists who read the book for publishers and kind of gave it a very negative review, and publishers never went. It's very bizarre because, if you think that Lang's books were selling 800,000 copies, 1 million copies, that book would have been a bestseller at that time. He was often misrepresented as a kind of Marxist. He was often misrepresented as a dangerous radical who was using patients for political ends. That's certainly true of the UK world, and to some extent in the US, he was a marginal figure also for that reason. So, I think he was desperate to be involved in debates in the UK and the US. He had connections to people like Maxwell Jones and to people in the US, actually. I found lots of letters to certain figures in the US, but he was influenced also by US writers like Goffman, not necessarily psychiatrists, Carl Rogers, to some extent. They never had a direct connection. That will be a whole history that needs to be written. The chapter in our book is one example that was kind of commissioned later on by my fellow editor, Tom Burns, and I think you know much more about that than I do. But I think the non-translation of his main texts was a crucial factor, especially at that time because books were so important then. It wouldn't be so important now, but I think it was crucial then.
Yeah, from your book, you say, quote, "The Negated Institution," which is the English translation of the title, "was the right book at the right time, a book whose time had come. It flew off the shelves going through 8 editions, sold 125,000 copies alone in 1968. So let's talk about this, because I know you are part of an effort to now finally have this book translated into English. What is in the book? What is the book?
It's funny because it's a strange book and it's often a misunderstood book. In fact, the book itself is an account of Gorizia. It says, a report from a psychiatric hospital, which was a kind of copy of a kind of Maoist title in the same book series. It said "Report from an Agricultural Commune" or something. It's very sort of 68 title. The book is a mixture of things. Some of it probably very boring now, sort of quite deep political arguments. It's written by a number of authors. Some of it amazing. So there's an introduction by a journalist who talks about the experience of Gorizia and kind of going through the fact that there's no gate and this whole. When people went to Gorizia, they often said it was like, seeing heaven or something. They often said I couldn't tell who the mad people and who the sane people were. It was an amazing experience which changed people's lives. I mean, literally changed people's lives. Many people sort of became psychiatrists after they saw Gorizia. So the book describes that, and that bit is very engaging. It also has, I think, very importantly, the actual words of the patients' interviews, which I think is a very important part of the book. And then there's this kind of very Basaglian thing, which is it's very critical of Gorizia. And it says, we've only gone so far, but we've created what he called a golden cage, and we need to kind of go further. So it was a call to arms. It was saying, you can copy us, but it's not enough. You need to destroy this institution because it's wrong, and we're going to tell you how to do it. And that's what the book is. So it's kind of in some ways of its time, but it's also very much still relevant.
So what has been the process then to try to secure the rights or the permission to translate this book? As I know you have been working on this now for several years.
It's kind of my life's work to get this book translated. I said in a debate in Italy, I said, before I die, I want to get this book translated. No, it's partly because it just needs to be done. And I said, it's just weird that it hasn't been done. But, we're dealing with complicated rights issues. I would like to make it a scholarly edition, something that in a way that explains, it's not on the surface absolutely straightforward reading that book what it means. So I'd like to make it something which could also be used, in universities and schools and so on, and asylums and therapeutic communities. So that's I think it needs to be done well with great care, and we're kind of battling through some bureaucracy on that with an American publisher and with the great help of Claudio Fogel from university as well. So I think we'll get there. And I think it's a book that will lead to a debate because, in many countries we still have asylums. In many countries people are tied up. In many countries mental illness is not given the dignity that it should have. And even in Italy, things in some areas are going backwards. People have been tied up, in Italy. So you've never won the final victory. You have to keep fighting every day on these things, I think.
So in your heart, you do believe this could, even in the 21st century, have a transformative impact on people who are working in the system or who are involved in policy. This is why it's so important to you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for this, I've done lots of different books and different projects, but this was by far the most stimulating and moving. And the people I came across time and again were just extraordinary people working in the system who had either come out of that experience or many people who had just read about that experience. So it's something that's quite urgent to me, not just on a sort of scholarly academic level. And, when I talk about it with the students, I do a course on institutions and anti-institutions, and I always start with Basaglia. And the engagement I get from the students is incredible. I mean, there's no other part of the course that really grabs their attention than this story. So I think it's also a great story. I don't like to see it as a kind of heroic story of one man against the system. It's a movement of many people, all different kinds of people who kind of succeeded in many things and in sort of re-evaluating the way that mental illness was understood and treated, which was an extraordinary thing. And also in freeing 100,000 people from those horrible places which they were kept in.
So if there's anyone listening in the United States publishing world that is holding this up, I am here to tell you that I think there is a huge appetite in the United States to change the system, to throw out the institutions that are not serving people at all. And we do have people tied up, chained, locked all throughout the United States. So this book has great potential to help open people's minds. I'm pretty excited about the prospect of this translation. Let me ask you a very practical question about that. Who does the translation? How do you figure out the best person who has the command of Italian and English to do the proper job?
It sounds very modest, but I'm going to do the translation. I've done a lot of translating over the years, hundreds and hundreds of translations. I actually, as a kind of side job, I worked for design magazines and things like that. So yeah, I'm going to do it also because I know the book very well, having studied it. And I've also looked at in my book about Basaglia, there's a whole chapter on this book, and I've looked at the archives around this book. And it's a book that has led to lots of kind of debates and arguments in Italy as well, about who was the real author. And, there was some big fallings out about it. So it's interesting also about that. So I'm going to do most of it, but hopefully in some cases, some of the technical material, I'll need help on that. It's not the US publisher holding up. It's the Italian side of things, which has been frustrating. But I think we're nearly there. I don't want to be too overconfident about that.
That is so good. So let me ask you, just as we come to a close here, there's been changes in the system in Trieste, given the changes in the regional government, which have been a bit concerning. I did have an opportunity to interview Dr. Roberto Mazzina on this podcast about 6 or 7 months ago, who gave us an update. It's worrisome to watch some of the beautiful aspects of that very humanistic system compromised by current political pressures in Trieste. What are you observing, and are you hopeful that can be contained? There was been worldwide attention paid to watching what's happening there. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
I mean, Trieste is so important because not just because of what happened there, but also because the way Trieste, the people in Trieste, the people who carried forward the Basaglian sort of method, as it were, very much made it their mission to communicate that to the world and to invite people to see what they were doing. And I think, like many people, I visited Trieste. I was welcomed there. I went to see, I think my most sort of powerful memory was going to see the emergency clinic inside the general hospital. Part of the Basaglia law was that you have to have an emergency clinic for people, in distress inside every general hospital in Italy. And that one was like a hotel. I mean, it didn't look like a ward. Nobody was wearing white coats. Everything was open, had really lovely furniture. It didn't really have any beds because Basaglia said the less beds, the better, because we don't want to recreate mini asylums. So Trieste is crucial. And I think in recent years, they've been battling against cuts and battling against attempts to roll back that mission, that mission of talking about this and communicating it and inviting people from all over the world. Many people have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times to Trieste. So, it's about local politics, it's about national politics, and it's something to keep a very careful eye on. Trieste is not the only place in Italy where things changed. It's not the only place where books were written, and there are many other interesting examples. But Trieste was kind of beacon and remains the beacon, and therefore it's very important that example is defended against the sort of forces of, I'd say, normality more than reaction into psychiatry.
It's so interesting that you bring up the Central Hospital, because whenever I try to tell the story of Trieste to an American audience, that is exactly where I start. That in a city of 230,000 people, there are 6 psych beds at the Central Hospital in an unlocked ward with no restraints. And it is exactly as you say, and it's because they don't let people get so sick that they would end up in the hospital. It's almost mind-boggling for people in the United States to think that that's even possible, but it is. And that is why we use that as the beacon of hope for how people could be treated better in this world.
Absolutely. And that whole idea of mental illness, seeing it as very much as a social, familial, it's not treating people and dealing with issues way before they get to that stage is very much part of the Basaglian ethos, and treating people as human beings and getting them jobs. There's a whole part we haven't talked about the incredible way that they use cooperatives to reintegrate people into society. And there's actually a great film called It Can Be Done, Si Può Fare, about that experience. And that was part of getting people out of the asylums was getting them meaningful work. And that's still going on in many parts of Italy. So Yeah, absolutely. It was, if you end up in that general sort of emergency ward, you know, they will treat you as a human being. They won't tie you up. But the whole point is you don't end up there. And that's, you know, if you end up there, they'll say they failed.
They failed.
You know,
yes.
They should have. Yeah, and so that's part of the message, as you say, of that place.
So let me just ask you this question, just to bring this to a close. You know, you probably never expected you would play such an important role in potentially mental health system reform in your own country, in the United States, elsewhere. But because you took the leap and you wrote the book, and I highly recommend the book, The Man Who Closed the Asylums, it will go into great detail about all the things that you've referenced today. The composite book from the 2018 symposium, and now hopefully L'Instituzione Negata, which we hope you will succeed in securing the permission to move forward with that translation, and we will help organize the book tour in the United States when that's done. What are your hopes for Basaglia's legacy kind of spreading into our 21st century world? What do you really hope for in all this?
I think it's urgent that those, not just Basaglia, but those ideas are, you know, brought back into the centre. I think there's a tendency now to lock up numerous people with mental health issues in prisons, and you know, the situation is really serious, and the demand for mental health services has never been so great. I mean, COVID I'm just reading things today about the UK, you know, the millions of people trying to access services of which aren't available. So, you know, the question of community services, of resourcing those, of the whole way of treating people is so urgent now that it's actually kind of essential that these kind of ideas and this kind of stories are brought back into this kind of centre where they were, but then they kind of slipped into the edge in the 90s and 2000s, and the kind of DSM models, you know, took over for many people. So I think it's just absolutely central, and more than ever that we talk about that experience, but also make it very relevant to the here and now.
Thank you for your passion about getting this done, and I just wish you Godspeed and not only getting the rights and then working on this translation quickly so that we can enter this book into the American mainstream. I thank you so much, John, for your patience with this podcast. As we crossed the globe via Zoom and ultimately WhatsApp to complete this conversation, and your patience with the technology associated therewith. But I know that people are really, really going to enjoy hearing about your work and hopefully do a deeper dive in the books that you've written. And I really, really look forward to the opportunity for us to meet in person, maybe even sometime this coming year.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
So many good resources were shared in this interview, and for those who are interested in doing a deeper dive into how Franco Basaglia viewed the world and how the Trieste mental health system has inspired leaders in other countries, the episode notes will take you there. I have my own copy of L'Instituzione Negata that I purchased from a bookstore in Trieste when I was there in 2019. I grabbed my Italian dictionary to use it as study homework, but got about 5 pages into the 447-page book and gave up. So I am delighted to wait for John to complete this job, and then maybe we will do a follow-up interview when it is published. Heartforward is lining up the final 5 episodes of this season, and there will be a 3 to 4 week break before the next episode is uploaded. It will be an interview with Dr. Mark Reagans and Dr. Dave Pilon, 2 men who were directly involved with the planning and implementation of the hugely successful pilot of an integrated service delivery system at the Village in Long Beach in the early 1990s. What that pilot demonstrated, and the culture of focusing upon the needs of the whole person and believing that recovery from mental illness is possible, remains as relevant as ever in this era where there is an appetite for system change. Thank you to my technical partners here at Verdugo Sound. Please subscribe to Heartforward Conversations from the Heart, and you will see this episode pop up when it goes live. Until then, ci vediamo.